This is the Oakeshott Type 14 sword made by Windlass Steelcraft. It's not an impressive sword, even given its measly asking price. So many things have been done wrong on this model, even though Windlass insists on keep making the sword for decades on end. This is the new Windlass Seneschal arming sword, based on an antique original housed at Musée de la Main in Paris. It's just released. You can hardly imagine this is by the same maker for the same price. The quality of it just blows my mind. It's done everything correctly where this one failed. So what is the story here? We're gonna find out.
Now, people in the community that are familiar with my work and opinions know that I have never been a huge fan of Windlass Steelcraft's work. You know, in the past, they design and implement swords that handle at best like broomsticks and at worst like crowbars. Why is that? Because they only really worry about the silhouette of the sword, and they often can get it right? But, you know, swords are not two-dimensional objects. There are lots of caveats in the mass distribution, in the details of the geometries, of hilt fittings, the blade, and of course, if you forego these traits like Windlass does, these swords are not going to handle like original swords that you claim to emulate, such as this Type 14 sword. It looks alright, just a rough silhouette, but it gets a lot of the details on the crossguard and pommel wrong, and also the cross sections, you know. And the worst thing is distal taper, right? It doesn't really thin down the thickness in this dimension until about, you know, 1/4 of the blade length from the tip. So even though you can balance the sword correctly, you know, make the point of balance in the correct place by adding a huge pommel lump of mass by the end, the overall, you know, weight distribution, the way it moves, accelerate, just doesn't feel correct for the type, you know, Type 14 specifically. But this is one of their better, you know, piece of work. Some of the other, you know, swords are just horribly imbalanced. Understand, even if you balance that correctly, swords are not barbells. You don't just hold them in the correct place and then just move them up and down. They have to be rotated. There's a lot of mass away from your hand. So in order to operate like a natural extension of your arm, you really need the correct mass distribution that comes from profile and distal taper, but also the cross section of the sword. Just look at how different it is. You know, these two swords are roughly the same dimension, you know, but this one feels like a feather, and you can rotate and accelerate appropriately like a weapon of your choice. Whereas the old Windlass models, now refurbished as the signature line or heritage line, didn't really implement anything Windlass has learned from their collaborations with Matt Easton and other experts. They insist on making swords in the old way because they were cheap back then. So even though they handle pretty much like a reenactment grade swords, like the Pika swords, which have pretty bad reputation, right? Given how horribly they handle, like just like inanimate objects that don't really accelerate correctly. But one thing you cannot deny is that Windlass swords used to be cheap. That's, I guess, the only merit, and they can look roughly correct in the background. So I guess you can use them as stage props, but I mean, you can sharpen them, and they are heat treated. They're not going to shatter or bend easily, but you know, they just don't handle like original swords. Some people say that, you know, the way they make hilt furnitures, they're not premium grade, they don't use good material, and those are things that, you know, you can forgive, because these you can upgrade yourself. End customers can get rid of this floppy sheaths, can rewrap this grip leather wrap, but you can't really grind proper geometries into this blade. Well, you can spend maybe 20 hours, 40 hours on that. I'm gonna review and modified version of the old Windlass model, the classic medieval sword. That sword is just completely done wrong, right? The original model weighs about 1,500 grams. Somewhere, along the line, they saw this is too heavy for arming sword, so they thinned it down slightly, but it's still the universal thickness. I don't know what Windlass is thinking. They shave off about 200 grams, but still the sword is way too heavy, close to 3 pounds for a medium-sized arming sword. Well, this Type 14 sword benefit a little bit from the gradual profile taper. It gets narrower compared to the base, so it doesn't really handle like a crowbar, but it's much closer to a crowbar than a sword. And the moment you pick up this sword, the new Seneschal model, you can just tell they're not of the same caliber. Yet curiously, they are of the same price, just over $300. The Seneschal sword is everything I can ask from a sword maker. Really, it did this one completely in the correct way. Everything from the most important mass distribution, a beautiful concave distal taper, and the correct profile taper based on the original sword housed at Musée de la Main in Paris. There's one sword that you can roughly categorize as Type 14 in the Hotel of Army Invalides that features this very iconic bronze globe pommel with fluted geometry. The only two complaints I have about this sword is one, even though the scabbard is properly made, that's thin and wood core, every time you sheath the blade inside and you draw it, there's some wood shaving, some red powder left on the blade. And first time I drew this blade, I saw it was red rust on the surface of the blade. And I thought, wow, this is gonna be hard to clean up. And what happened here? But actually, it's just wood shaving. It's easily, wiped off. But you can see the amount of wood shaving. Every single time you sheath the sword, it's gonna be the same story. So I don't know what. This is a properly constructed scabbard. I don't know why they decide to do this, not clean it up. It's as if it's against company policy to make everything properly, but shame that this is the end result. And the other complaint is minor. This is a sword marketed as sharp, but the edge is thin and it's not really sharpened. This is actually what I call butter knife sharpness. You see, the edge is rounded, but it's relatively thin. I think you can probably cut bread or butter with it, but there's no way you can do practice cutting at this level. You have to do some work yourself, and you can see the bright line. If you just rotate the blade, and you can see there's a curved surface around the surface at the edge. So it's not apex that two surfaces meet on a point, right? Of course, it wouldn't be very difficult to sharpen, and we'll see how it performs once I sharpen it up. It's just a shame that end customer has to do work themselves. Well, I predict maybe 5 to 10 minutes on the work sharp will bring this blade to razor sharp, but you still have to do work while the product description explicitly states edge sharp, right? So that's just not correct. At least you should let customers know this is unsharpened, but the edge is very thin and ready to take a real edge. Or you offer some, service for extra costs, but this is not acceptable. Overall, for a sword, I don't think it's a big issue because I think most customers should learn how to sharpen their swords. You're gonna have to service sharpen the blades again and again eventually. And this is the same level of sharpness on the Royal Armouries Collection swords in collaboration with Matt Easton. When this sword was delivered to me, the package felt suspiciously light, right? It's much lighter than a usual sword in a box. And when I unpacked it, pick it up, I said, wow, this is a featherweight sword. But when I weighed it, it shows 1,040 grams, 2 pounds and 4 ounces. So it's a lightweight arming sword for its size, 27.7 inches long and 32 inches in overall length. It's a proper weight, and you can feel some weightiness in certain parts of the blade, but it's in the correct place. And that hugely comes from this pommel done right. The original in the Musée de la Main weighs about 1,000 grams, and this one is just 40 grams heavier because that sword is properly preserved. There's not a lot of corrosion, material loss, so it's really missing just the grip. And a grip on an arming sword usually weighs about 40 grams or so, the wood core and the leather wrap on top. So it means that this sword is completely accurate in the weight. But if you just look at all the hilt fitting, especially this pommel, this solid, bronze globe pommel, fluted, you know that it's not overly, weighty, because if you knock on the pommel, it's partially hollow, just as the original pommel. If you made this solid, and you can see, it's like a mace head, right? So this sword would weigh a lot heavier. Of course, smiths that don't know better, that don't taper their blade thickness gradually, will only rely on putting an overweight pommel at the end of the sword to shift the point of balance. But like I discussed before, swords are not barbells. It's not just the weight and balance that matter. You have to have the correct weight distribution on the blade alone. And then you still have the correct counterweight on the pommel. So, however this pommel is constructed, it must have the correct cavity in the center to offset its overall mass. The point of balance is beautiful on this sword, 3.2 inches from the crossguard. And for its low weight and compact size, it's an extremely maneuverable sword. And you can pull off a lot of sword and buckler techniques. And this sword being named Seneschal, basically a major domo, essentially a chief of staff of a royal, household, etc., shows that this sword is designed to be a civilian carry sword, everyday carry. It's supposed to be compact, so you don't knock down objects when you walk around. It should be very handy and shows your status. At the same time, it can provide, proper protection, as your personal, sidearm, etc. So, lots of things done right, and I have to praise. Even though the old Windlass swords have these simpler, hilt fittings, like leather wrapping, just very simple leather wrap. What Windlass has learned from the Royal Armouries Collection collaboration with Matt Easton, the proper grip construction, being tapered in both the thickness and the width, having the cord impression on the leather, and also usually have them dyed instead of just plain black leather, all contributed to how properly constructed this sword is. And you can see the grip is thin near the crossguard to be flush with the dimension of the crossguard, but it turns to be more cylindrical as it meets the pommel. So it tapers in this dimension, but also this dimension. The circumference of the grip feels just right to me, which aids in its overall maneuverability. Having the cord wrap on the leather provides a lot extra traction when you handle the sword. It's not slippery. Of course, modern reproductions, like adding risers near the crossguard or near the pommel, I think that will help it to look a little bit more like modern premium swords. But you know, this is not a universal practice back in the Middle Ages. You see lots of swords with surviving grips still intact, don't really have all the risers. This one doesn't have any riser, and I think it looks fine because the bronze globe pommel being fluted, that will take a lot of, you know, attention away. The crossguard is relatively simple, but we're going to talk about it. It's not really that simple at all. So the grip, you just want it to be a little bit low profile, to be ergonomic. That's enough. And it does have the core impression, and it is also skived, right? Where it's not stitched on the side, it joins from both sides, and it's compressed and then glued, and then probably ground down a little bit in the thickness. On the old Windlass Royal Armouries Collection swords, it's also constructed like this, but I have some issue with where the leather overlap. There's overt thickness on one side, and you can start peeling off the leather. Also, when you handle the sword, it doesn't feel very comfortable, very noticeable. But there's no such concern at all on this grip. It's properly skived. I think it's also lacquered over, when they paint. I don't know whether it's painted or dyed, but it has a very stunning red color. It has a great contrast with yellowish bronze color. So definitely well done on the grip, and that's credit to Matt Easton teaching Windlass how to properly construct medieval swords grips. And then you look at the crossguard. This is probably the simplest part on the entire hilt. You think it's just a simple straight crossguard with some short crillons, but it is actually done faithfully based on the original sword in Paris. And you can see the thickness tapers, right? It's thicker in the center, and it thins down as it approaches the end of the quillon, but then it swells up at the extremity. So it has ebbs and flows. And then if you turn this around and look at the side of this crossguard, you can see it's not just one flat surface. It actually has four-sided geometry, but in the center, they don't just meet to become a diamond. There's a line, short line in the center. So this is a detail that they totally captured from the original sword. They must have some very adequate help. And a few new models at Windlass was credited to Matt Easton as further collaborations, such as the Windlass new 1796 light cavalry saber. Check out my review of that sword. Also a phenomenal sword, very close to the antiques. And then there's a Viking era sword that's new. Didn't really get a lot of attention, but apparently it's based on an original sword in Ireland. This one wasn't really credited to Matt Easton, so I don't know who provided the dimensions and measurements of this sword. Obviously, Windlass did a phenomenal job. And I think this sword is on the same level as many premium reproductions. And it's also better than some of the custom bespoke swords crafted by certain European swordsmiths. Maciej Kopcio, for example, who made a replica of this sword and didn't really capture the side of its crossguards detail. Worse, he didn't really do any distal taper in the blade, so just a crowbar, and he made a solid pommel. So you can see on his product page, eventually this sword weighs, made by him, right, weighs 1,300 grams, whereas this one weighed just over 1 kilogram, which is completely accurate to the original. So do yourself a favor, pick up a $330 sword that's very close replica of the original sword at Musée de l'Ami, rather than a custom sword made by someone who should know better. And the other details, such as the peen block, is also captured correctly. Well, this kind of hilt construction is actually relatively popular at the end of 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century. You see a few examples. One is at a museum in Cambridge, and that one missed the entire top half of the sword blade. It's fragmented. But based on the base of the blade, your Oakeshott estimated that sword to be a type 12 sword. If you look at the silhouette of this sword, it's roughly a type 14 sword. It doesn't have the iconic hilt flare shoulder on the base of the blade, but still it's very broad, And based on the blade length and how it tapers, I think it's accurate to say it's a Type 14 sword. In fact, this is very close to the illustration by your Oakeshott, as the archetype of Type 14 swords. It's just not the most iconic shape, right? But I think it's accurate. Better yet, this one has a beautiful lenticular cross section. And you can see on the upper 1/3 of the blade, there's no central ridge. Finally, Windlass got the memo and got rid of the ugly central ridge on their earlier medieval swords. This one doesn't feature the flare shoulder near the hilt, but this is completely accurate to the original sword. And it's rather broad as well. At the base, the blade is 65 millimeters wide, and it has this gradual taper. Near the tip, it's not very acute, unlike some of the Type 14 swords. So I would say in silhouette, this is more of a crossover between Type 12, earlier medieval arming swords, and Type 14. This wouldn't be a phenomenal thruster, but I guess that most Type 14 swords are still cut-centric swords. They just have like a more noticeable profile taper, narrowing down, because they want to feel a little bit more lively to combine the profile taper and the distal taper, rather than intentionally creating a more acute point. Of course, it coincides with the widespread of mail armor and the prevalence of gambesons on lower rank troops. Some enhanced thrusting capacity is very helpful, right, against these lower grades armor, but this just wouldn't do much against plate armor. There's no way at all to penetrate steel directly, but even with this tip, trying to find the gap between plate armor, it will be a fool's errand, right? And against thicker and more rigid gambeson, I doubt this tip can go very deep, but we shall see. Against just flesh and clothing, yeah, there's no question this tip will do just fine, and it opens up a wound very quickly, right? It becomes widened. But for the most part, this is clearly a cutting-oriented sword, and the lenticular cross-section of the upper portion just confirms that. And I think the most praiseworthy trait of this reproduction is how it handles not just the profile and the cross-section, but also the distal taper. This is probably the most difficult part, especially for swords in lower price ranges, because they want to save money in that. They don't want to grind it or forge it properly. Well, this sword has a plaque that comes with it saying this is completely hand forged. Okay, kudos to Windlass. Doesn't matter how you make your sword, as long as your end product is correct, that's all you can ask for. This one features a beautiful concave distal taper, meaning that the rate of thinning down is not uniform. Right? It's not like 5 millimeters at the base, 4 here, and 3 near the tip. No, it actually thins down very quickly. At the base, it's over 5 millimeters, 5.1 millimeters thick, but it quickly thins down in the thickness. Reaches about 2.5 millimeter at the half point. By the way, 6 inches from the base, it's already at 3.5 millimeters. So it just thins down very quickly, and then it basically stops thinning down at midsection because it's already half as thick as a base. Here it transitions into the lenticular cross section after the end of filler, so the thickness swells up ever slightly to like 2.7 millimeters, but it comes down pretty quickly and go back to 2.5 millimeters. So on the upper portion, upper half is only half the thickness. It also slims down noticeably. So even though it doesn't really get very narrow, this sword has shaved out a lot of the mass on the upper portion compared to the base. And this is very difficult to do, because if you rely on stock removal method to make the correct geometry, you're going to grind a lot. Because if you make a sword with 5 millimeter stock, blade blank, you're going to have to shave out tons of steel from the blade. This one, however, I think is hand forged. So when you hand forge swords, you can obviously preserve mass more appropriately. So this one is just done completely correctly. The end result justifies it, right? Like it's how lively it is, how quick it is, comparing to a sword even slightly shorter of this one. Just like you can see how the upper portion still has so much more mass. It carries your even entire body, whereas this one, it's definitely a natural extension of your arm, right? It feels very, very light, and that doesn't just come from the low point of balance. It's not that low. 3.2 inches from the guard is appropriate. You still feel the mass behind your chop, right? And you can do proper sword and buckler work with this one, given how responsive that is. And that's just, the result of having the correct mass distribution. And having a thinner blade on the upper portion makes sure that the edge angle is small, right? This one is unsharpened, and we'll talk about the problem with that later, but the edge is pretty thin. I think it's at, 0.5, 0.4 millimeters, and it's rounded like a butter knife, so you can sharpen it yourself. It's gonna cut very well, with a smooth, gradual transition from the edge to the thickest part. It's a lenticular cross-section, just beautifully done. The tip is also very well formed. It conforms with the original's geometry perfectly. So the cutting reveals that this is indeed quite a beast, right? Of a compact size, packs quite a punch, cuts through tougher plastic bottles with ease. Whereas, the Cutler Custio sword is also a very fast and nimble, lightweight arming sword, right? But it had trouble cutting through tougher targets because it does lack the mass where this one has. And this one indeed has quite a bit of, width, even on the upper portion. And it has a more robust edge geometry, on this lenticular cross-section without the footer. So this means that even though it has a healthy degree of profile taper and distal taper, it still retains some mass because the cross-section isn't exactly 100% the same as this lower portion, except it's narrower and thinner. So it's something very robust that brings a little bit extra steel on the upper portion, which means that while it's still very much lightweight and nimble, easy to accelerate, it has a stout feeling to it. And something I didn't really anticipate is how this short-bladed sword feels quite, stout and just in the cutting, and feels a little bit lacking in the tip speed. One reason is that it has a short blade, right? If you have longer blades, obviously the tip or the upper portion is further away from your hand, so it has a longer distance to accelerate, right? With this one, it's not hard to accelerate at all because you can still, even with the blade in front of you, you can still chamber back the blade by releasing, middle ring and pinky fingers to chamber back the blade, create some distance. But as it travels forward, it can hardly fully rotate to be flush with your forearm, which can be helpful because if you rotate to this, position, when the blade meets the target, it lacks a little bit of structure and support. And if you meet resistance, the blade tends to roll because your hand and wrist doesn't provide adequate support, even though the blade is already properly accelerated. So there's a bit of trade-off, of course, and this globe pommel, which is usually, not very popular until the 16th century when side swords and rapiers appeared. It really replaced the prevalent, ubiquitous wheel pommels that were popular between the 11th and 15th century. But there were earlier examples of globe or spherical pommels, like this one. This one is partially hollow,
which is why it has such a, you know, adequate size. But what it does is kind of like some African crowbars, which have half cup pommel, which is like half a sphere, and it really, you know, collide with the lower portion of your palm when you rotate the sword, right? Tends to stop you from fully rotating the blade because it gets into the way. And what this does is that you basically stop the blade at this location and you drag or chop downward. This way, the base of the palm provides some support, you know, to the blade, because your hand is not overextended. So some bit of trade-off. So make the sword kind of choppy, right? Well, you really have to consider, you know, the lenticular cross-section and the broad blade, even on the upper portion, accentuates this is still very much a cutting-oriented sword. Even though it's very nimble and compare easily with a buckler for that kind of, you know, martial, you know, prowess display, when coupled with a buckler instead of like a full-size, you know, arming sword for mounted or on foot combat, right, in battle. So this one is easily a sword for an officer status, noble or a knight, as a, you know, backup sword when you operate larger weapons such as pole axes. But I have to say, given its lightweight and nimble characteristics, it's still quite a beast in test cutting. Not as much in the thrust, because you can see this tip is just not a thrust-oriented, you know, geometry. Even though it's not exactly bad against personnel without, you know, metal armor, you know, mail armor or plate armor protection, this can still go through even very thick gambeson without too much problem. But you do need some resistance, and we can see that the relative adequate flexibility, right, or I should say rigidity, really aided the cutting as well. So this is easily a very confident, you know, cutting-oriented sword, and it shows the caliber of Windlass' recent development. The Crossguard has some sharp edges because they are simple square cross-section. The less facets you have on an object, each corner has greater sharpness or smaller angle, obviously. Imagine this is octagonal, each corner will have 135-degree angle rather than 90-degree angle. So obviously you need to take care to file down or sand down the edges. It's supposed to be very easy. I took some sandpaper and it really took me about 5 minutes or so to make these sharper edges very rounded, wouldn't cause any discomfort. So that's something I can forgive because it's a $330 sword, or less so when it's on sale. Something like end customers should be able to address themselves. Of course, I appreciate if manufacturers, you know, provide adequate fighting to avoid discomfort or actual work on customers' end. But this is easier than other, like a sharpening of the edges or cleanup of the inside of scabbard. Overall, it's still an excellent value for this package of museum quality reproduction. You can get it, you know, 15%, 20% off. So that's like way below even $300, which really begs the question why Windlass is still selling these old crowbars for the same price. They should just totally retire the whole thing or do them properly. You know, it's not really that hard. Get the correct geometry on the crossguard and grind the blade of this Type 14 sword as this one over here. But there's no comparison between this Seneschal and the old Type 14. Which should you pick? You should just throw this one away into the trash can, because to even do work to make it proper, you have to spend a lot of money or time. It's just not worth it to have, you know, a half-finished sword. You spend like $300. It's not acceptable. Whereas this one is everything you can ask for.
I think the caliber of this sword totally puts it on the same level as many even just premium reproduction swords. Just the attention to detail really shows that how much Windlass has learned from, several years of collaborations with Matt Easton over the Royal Armouries Collection swords, but also, some models based on antiques. So study antique originals really helps you, implementing swords correctly. And we are blessed in the year 2026 with so many options of properly made reproduction swords under a budget. And you don't have to spend $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 to buy a properly constructed sword. This one has everything done correctly. Even the scabbard is wood core, unlike the usual Windlass floppy sheaths made of only leather. This one is completely rigid, right? Wood core, leather wrapping on top, same color, well, similar color as the grip. The grip has a slightly purple hue. This one has a more orange hue to it, but it has a properly designed shape. It also has this globe with fluted geometry to mirror the pommel. So that's just very thoughtful. It feels like a design by the likes of Matt Easton, but it didn't really credit Matt Easton, so I don't know whether Matt Easton got involved in this. But this is a properly made shape, and it doesn't look like any other shape from the other models in the Royal Armouries Collection. So kudos to Windlass, and you really convinced me you can make proper swords. And this one is 100% steel. And do yourself a favor, pick this one up if you are interested in medieval swords at all, especially sword and buckler, because it's such a handy, compact size arming sword. Even just by itself, it's proper, sidearm for a court official like a seneschal. And I'm very happy to have this in my collection. I have several dozens of premium reproduction swords. Obviously, on reproduction swords, the most important traits you should look for is always how to capture the spirit of the original performance, handling characteristics, and construction, right? And this sword has done everything right on a budget, and we're blessed to have this quality in 2025 on entry-level swords. So keep doing the good work, Windlass. And if you find any value or entertainment of this video, stay tuned. We're gonna have lots of good stuff in the near future. Until then, please like and subscribe.